All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you for joining me this evening for our second of our 3 webinars in the Sea Grant Reef Fish webinar series. My name is Ryan McMullen. I'm going to be your host for this evening's presentation. I currently serve as Sea Grant South Atlantic Reef Fish Extension and Communication Fellow, where I work with Sea Grant offices throughout the South Atlantic region, from North Carolina through Florida, to support projects that advance stakeholder understanding of the issues management and ongoing study of our federally managed reef fish species. For those of you who may be less familiar with Sea Grant, Sea Grant is a federal university partnership program that supports coastal, marine, and Great Lakes communities through extension and education, industry training, and applied science programs. This includes providing science-based resources to fishermen on issues like fishing sustainability and risk management, stock status and health, habitat needs, and more. If you're curious about work Sea Grant does in your state, feel free to reach out to me in the chat, or you can always send me an email after the webinar, and I'll be happy to connect you with your state's Sea Grant representative. So this Reef Fish webinar series exists to highlight a small selection of the impactful research that Sea Grant supports and provide commercial, recreational, and for-hire fishermen with additional science-backed insights into their fishery and how it may be changing. These webinars are meant to be interactive, so we encourage participants to submit questions for our Q&A segment that will be held at the end of the meeting. Once the Q&A segment does begin, you can either raise your hand using the button there. That's where it looks like a line art turkey or a hand, depending on your angle. And once you raise your hand, we can unmute you from our end, and then you would then unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can always leave it in the question box anytime during the presentation, and I'll read them out in chronological order once Kevin finishes his presentation. So last week during the webinar, we heard about the history, drivers, and future approaches to understanding shark depredation in the South Atlantic. And tonight we speak with Kevin Craig to hear more about how fishery scientists in South Atlantic are working to understand how our fisheries are impacted by ecosystem level changes, including those driven by a warming ocean. Kevin Craig is the branch chief for the Atlantic Caribbean Reef Fish branch at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, located in Beaufort, North Carolina. His primary responsibilities are to oversee several fisheries independent surveys, which provide important information to support stock assessments and ecosystem monitoring in the region. As a researcher, he's generally interested in ecosystem effects on fish populations and fisheries and how best to incorporate this information into resource management. He received his undergraduate degree at North Carolina State University, a master's degree in fisheries from the University of Washington, and his PhD in ecology from Duke, but notably is not a Duke sports fan. We appreciate that. Before joining the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, Kevin was a faculty at North State University, and nowadays in his spare time, he likes to ride motorcycles, spend time with his 3 daughters, and is an avid hiker. So without further ado, Kevin, thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll give you the reins for the slideshow.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Thank you for coming on an Easter Monday with the tip-off for the final NCAA game in a couple of hours. As Ryan mentioned, I went to Duke, but I'm not a Duke fan, so I was not upset that UConn beat Duke a couple of days ago. I appreciate the invitation. I think this is a great venue to help try to connect some of the science that's going on at the Southeast Center and more broadly in the region with the end users and stakeholders. So today I'm going to talk about a climate vulnerability assessment for U.S. South Atlantic fishes. It includes reef fishes, but it also includes a number of other species. In fact, all of the primary managed species in the South Atlantic region. And I just want to start by saying that we know that fisheries occur within a very complex ecosystem. And over half of the U.S. population currently lives on the coast or within close proximity to the coast. If you look at this graph on the right, it shows population growth in the South Atlantic region since the 1800s. We consider the South Atlantic basically Florida through North Carolina to the Virginia border. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, fairly low population size with a few centers, mostly an agricultural-based economy. But we really started to see a diversification of the economic base of the region and more industrialization beginning in the 50s with a number of ports, Wilmington, Jacksonville, and Miami. And then more recently since the 2010s, or in the 2010s, it's primarily a recreationally and tourism-based economy. It's one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. And we know that the human activities in this region that are occurring on land and in the coastal watersheds that drain down to coastal ecosystems, as well as in the open ocean, are affecting the ecosystem in a variety of ways. There's a potential to alter the marine food web. We know that there's growing interest and concern about changes in climate, but also other things like damage to habitat, introduction of invasive species, nutrient and other sources of pollution, and so on. So if we look at the tools that we have to help inform fisheries management, we've largely relied on stock assessments. You've heard of stock assessments. They're basically an approach to synthesize all of the information on a particular species, reconstruct the historical abundance of that species and the history of fishing mortality, use that information to try to determine the status of the stock, and whether it's overfished or whether there's overfishing that's occurring, and then try to project forward what might be a sustainable yield from that stock. So in the South Atlantic, this has been going on for 2.5 decades. Some of the first stock assessments were formalized in the early 2000s. So we have over a 25-year history of stock assessments in the region. And they've been a pretty effective tool to help inform management decisions. But there are some limitations. They've largely been single species in nature. And there's this growing interest and a growing need for more information on the ecosystem, how the ecosystem may be changing, and how do we account for that in management and perhaps incorporate it into our stock assessments. And that's a much more recent endeavor. There's a number of pressures that marine systems are experiencing that you can see on the right that include fishing, but also extend to other things like climate, which we'll talk about today, habitat loss, and increasingly multi-sector use of the oceans. So we're seeing increases in wind energy, other sorts of energy development, aquaculture, and so on. So we need some method to start to understand these factors, monitor them over time, and then incorporate them into how we're managing our fisheries. So I'm going to talk about climate vulnerability assessment, or CVA, which is one tool that we have for doing that. It's an approach that takes a really broad overview of the system, the species that are important in the system, and then tries to assess how they may be vulnerable or not to future changes in climate in the region. So I'll talk about that process. We recently completed the first CVA in the South Atlantic. And then I'll talk about a couple of case studies that are ongoing that are more specific to snapper grouper. In particular, we've seen some declines in recruitment for a number of snapper and grouper species. And there's also concern over potential shifts in distribution that may be expansions in distribution into the region or out of the region, or perhaps shifts in distribution. And those may or may not be related to climate change per se, but they're certainly impacted by the ocean, the conditions in the ocean, and processes that are potentially influenced by changes in climate. So what is a climate vulnerability assessment? Well, this is a process to determine the relative vulnerability of fish stocks to changes in climate that may affect the species abundance, so how many are in the region, or the biomass that's in the region, their productivity, so how quickly they're adding new fish to the population, or how rapidly fish that are in the population are growing, or their distribution, their geographic distribution. Is their distribution changing? Is it contracting? Is it expanding? Is it shifting? And I've underlined relative here because the best way to think about this is if you take all of the species in the system and you want to rank them in terms of those that are highly vulnerable to climate and those down to those that are less vulnerable to climate. That's kind of the intent of this approach, is to provide a relative ranking of species in terms of their vulnerability to climate. And this is being done in all of the large marine ecosystems around the United States, from the Bering Sea to California Current to the Gulf of Mexico. In the Southeast, we just completed this a couple of years ago, and everything I'm going to tell you today is available online and in these reports. There's a report that you can get at this link that goes through all of, or at this link that goes through all of the details of the CVA for the South Atlantic. There's a journal article that came out last year, and all of this information has been compiled into an online tool. It's called a climate vulnerability assessment tool, which you can reach at this link here. And with this tool, you can go in and you can pick a region. South Atlantic's one among 7 or 8 different regions around the US. You can pick a species. In this case, this is for Almaco jack. And then you can get information in a pretty easily digestible format on their vulnerability, whether it's high, moderate, or low, and other aspects that went into determining that vulnerability, how sensitive they are to factors that may change with climate, and their exposure to factors that might change with climate. So I'd encourage you to visit these links if you want more information. The CVA for the South Atlantic included 71 species. Number of functional groups included reef fishes, both species that occur on the shelf, as well as deeper water species on the shelf break and upper slope. Coastal fishes that occur in estuaries or the nearshore coastal ocean. Pelagic species, both species that are coastal migratory, like cobia, as well as species that have larger circumpolar distributions, like mahi-mahi or wahoo, that have a really broad distribution but pass through the South Atlantic and support important fisheries in the region. We include diagenous species. These are species that will migrate back and forth between the estuaries and the open ocean, as well as a number of invertebrates and a number of shark species. So the idea was to take a really synthetic approach of what species are important in the South Atlantic and try to assess what their vulnerability is to climate. The criteria were basically that they're managed species. So all of these species are managed in some way. They're in an FMP, or they're important in commercial or recreational landings. Some cases they're ecologically important, but perhaps not important in the landing. So things like bay anchovy and some of the more forage species, or species that are of conservation concern. You have a couple of species in the region that are ESA listed or otherwise of concern due to their low abundance. The other thing that's interesting and worth pointing out about the South Atlantic is all of these species are subject to a number of management authorities. That includes the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, highly migratory species, And in some cases, there's local management that's being done by the Park Service, or for example, in Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, as well as by the individual states. And most of these 71 species are subject to more than one management authority. So it can be a pretty complex management process. And the general approach for the CVA, it's not to collect new information, it's not to do field studies, it's really to synthesize information that's currently available and maybe look at it in a way that hasn't been done so before. So it's based on existing literature, it's based on existing data, particular output from global climate models that tell us how the ocean may change in the future based on different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And then a synthesis of what's known about each one of these species. And then that information is used and scored by a group of experts. So we elicit expert opinion to kind of assess that information and use a scoring process to try to rank these species in terms of their vulnerability. So, you know, the main advantage of this approach is that it's pretty fast. It's repeatable. It's a standardized approach that can be done repeatedly, and the intent is to do this iteratively over time. And it can be used to assess a large number of species simultaneously. You can imagine if we tried to do detailed studies of every one of these individual species, it would take a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of resources. So this gives us a way to look at all of these species simultaneously. And then it can be used for a number of purposes. One is to prioritize more directed research. So I'll give a couple of case studies later that are more focused research projects. How should we allocate our monitoring effort? It can also be used to help identify which stocks might benefit from incorporating environmental parameters into stock assessments. There's advantages and disadvantages to doing that. So we would like to know which species would benefit the most. And then it can provide us some information on risk. And that can be risk from climate change, but it can also go into broader risk assessments that look not just at climate, but things like fishing or overfishing, as well as habitat degradation. And it can help with scenario planning. There's a number of scenario planning efforts along the Atlantic seaboard that are trying to figure out what's likely going to happen in the future under future climate conditions. Okay, so what is climate vulnerability composed of? It really consists of two components. One is exposure. So that's the degree to which a species will experience some change in a factor that's influenced by climate. And that would be things like sea surface temperature, salinity, ocean acidification, currents, upwelling. For species that are close to shore and estuary, sea level rise can be important. So these are factors that are likely to change under future climate, and we need to know what the exposure is of different species to those factors. Second component is sensitivity, biological sensitivity. So these are traits that are indicative or related to the ability of a species to respond to changes in its environment. So these include things like complexity in reproduction, dispersal of early life stages. We have a number of species that are broadcast spawners that disperse larvae over large distances. Certain aspects of the early life history, do they have certain settlement requirements in terms of habitat? A number of the snapper grouper species are heavily reliant on hard bottom habitat for settlement. And generally, how specific are their habitat requirements? Do they have specific prey requirements? As adults, are they mobile or are they not mobile? We have quite a range of species, some sharks, mahi, some of the pelagics, incredibly mobile over very large distances. Other species, like some of the reef species, at least as adults, appear to have relative limited mobility. And then, because we're talking about climate and temperature change, thermal preferences are important. Population growth rate, how fast is it a weedy species that can grow really fast, or is it more like a redwood that takes a really long time to grow and increase in size? And also the stock status. If you have a population that is overfished, then that in some cases can make that species more vulnerable to other stressors like changes in climate. So we have these two components, climate exposure and biological sensitivity. And then we also assess the potential for distribution change. So this isn't, will the species change its distribution? It's based on these characteristics, or a subset of the characteristics, is it likely to shift its distribution as conditions change? So for example, if you have a fish that has widely dispersed larvae that are covered, that are distributed over broad distances over a relatively long time frame, species with high adult mobility, species with strong temperature preferences. So if temperature where they exist increase, they may leave. Or if they have fairly general habitat requirements, they're not required, they're not dependent on, say, seagrass beds or coral reefs or something like that. Those types of species are more likely to undergo these shifts in distribution. And so we use a subset of these sensitivity attributes to try to assess, well, based on the ecology, the life history of these species, which ones are more likely and which ones are less likely to change their distribution. As I mentioned, this is based on elicited expert opinion. This has a long history in environmental science. It's particularly useful when there's not a lot of hard data available, or when you're trying to base decisions or make inferences based on existing data. So we established a 16-member panel that conducted the CVA. These people had an average of about 26 years of experience working in the South Atlantic. We had some newcomers that had been in the region for about 5 years, and we had some old timers that were been working in the region for over 50 years. So a broad range of experience. These were mostly scientists. I will say it would be interesting to conduct a similar process with stakeholders or people who are on the water. But for this particular iteration of the CVA, we used a panel of scientific experts that came from state agencies, government agencies, universities, and so on. And to get at those exposure factors, we use the output from global climate models, which you can see here on the right top graph. So this is, again, a projection of what the ocean will look like over the next 50 years based on emission scenarios. And then we overlay that information with what's known about the species distribution. So is it mostly an inshore estuarine species? Is it a shelf species? Is it a deep water species? And so on. So that gets us the exposure part of it. And then to get the sensitivity, we basically summarize information that's available on each of those 71 species into a species narrative. So it's a synthesis of everything that's known. How long does that species live? When does it mature? What type of reproductive system does it have? And so on. And then those get scored. So we score, the panel scores those in terms of these categories: low, moderate, high, or very high. And then we combine the climate exposure and the biological sensitivity to get an overall score of vulnerability. And I'm not going to go through the details, but the details of the methodology are laid out in the in those reports. And it's a standardized methodology across all of the different regions. So it not only lets us get at climate vulnerability in the South Atlantic, but also how does the South Atlantic compare, for example, to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Northeast Shelf or these other regions. And we can make those comparisons because it is a standard and accepted methodology across all of the different marine ecosystems. And you can see this information for yourself. This is an example of a species narrative. This is for gray triggerfish, and you can see what its overall vulnerability ranking was, what its biological sensitivity was, what its exposure was, and then all the details of the scoring of those different attributes. So all of this is available in those documents. And we also take into account the quality of the data. So there's a data quality score. So some species we have a lot of information on, others we don't. And that affects our assessment of how certain we are about what the vulnerability of those species are likely to be. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides that look like this that just describe the main results. They're presented as this traffic light type plot where the reddish colors are species that are of potential concern. They tend to have high climate vulnerability. And then the lighter colors are more moderate or less vulnerable to climate. So the bottom line from this assessment was about 2/3 of these species in the South Atlantic, 46 out of 71, had very high in red or high climate vulnerability. The highest species was Atlantic sturgeon, but included in that is a number of reef fish species, particularly deep water species like snowy grouper, speckled hind. The remaining 25 species in this bottom right corner in yellow had moderate climate vulnerability. And if you notice in the green, there was no species that had low climate vulnerability. So what that's suggesting is that the majority of the species in our region are likely to experience some impacts from climate. In terms of the species groups, the most vulnerable groups were the diadromous species, like Atlantic sturgeon as an example, a number of invertebrates, particularly eastern oyster, and then some of the deeper water reef fishes, snowy grouper, Warsaw grouper. Species that showed the least vulnerability tended to be more pelagic species like bay anchovy, or they tend to be highly migratory, highly mobile species, like little tunny, striped mullet, species that tend to have rapid movements, long migrations, fairly general habitat requirements. They tend to have the lowest vulnerability. So if we just look a little bit deeper, I know some of these names are difficult to read here. If we look at reef fishes as a group, the offshore reef fishes, and I mean mostly those that are in the snapper grouper complex that occur on the continental shelf and the upper slope in the South Atlantic, they were the most variable group. They were a highly variable group. Some of the most vulnerable reef fishes were these deep water species, snowy grouper, Warsaw, gag, or scamp, speckled hind. Also some species that seem to be much more common in the South, where the South Atlantic may be kind of near the northern limit of where they could occur, things like Goliath grouper. And then species that had more moderate vulnerability tended to be snappers. These are shorter lived, than the reef fishes, maybe a little bit more faster growing, higher intrinsic rate of growth, things like red snapper, mutton snapper, gray snapper, yellowtail. And then the species that had the lowest vulnerability, which is this yellow box, tended to be those species that are just widely distributed throughout the South Atlantic. Species like gray triggerfish, vermilion snapper, greater amberjack tended to have the lower vulnerability than some of the snappers, and particularly the groupers. What's driving the vulnerability? So we can assess which of the exposure factors, the climate exposure factors, and which of those sensitivity attributes are most important for determining vulnerability of these species to climate. And all species had really high exposure to one or more climate factors, in particular, characteristics of the offshore ocean. So maybe that's not surprising. Most of the species in the South Atlantic either occur in offshore oceanic waters exclusively, or at least during a part of their life history. Even estuarine-dependent species typically move offshore to spawn. So things like ocean acidification, sea surface temperature, changes in salinity tended to be the exposure factors that had the biggest impact. And I should also say, we don't know the mechanism, and these could be affecting these species directly. Certainly things like sea surface temperature can affect growth rates and survival and so on, but they also may be indicative of other processes. So sea surface temperature can affect the distribution of prey, for example. So we can't really make claims about exactly how these factors work, except to say that it's really the offshore oceanic environment that's driving the exposure factors that are going into that vulnerability. In terms of the sensitivity attributes, population growth rate was a big one. So that's that, are they a weedy species that is short-lived and grows rapidly, or are they a long-lived species that has a old maximum age, late age at maturity, and grows slowly? So that was kind of the most important factor. But also stock status was important. So, and again, this is if species are depleted or if there's overfishing going on, then that can make them more vulnerable to these sorts of factors associated with climate, and it can lead to further declines, or it could potentially impede recovery. So there is this interaction between the status of the population that can be impacted by fishing and the effects of climate. And then the third main set of factors had to do with the early life history. So are they highly dispersed larvae, or like Atlantic sturgeon, do they breed in estuaries and lay eggs on the bottom? And also sort of things like larval survival and settlement habitat. How specific are their habitat requirements? So that's the climate vulnerability, and that's operating under the assumption that species don't leave the region. But we also know that species can shift their geographic distribution. So when we use essentially the same process, using some of those sensitivity attributes and the scoring process that we used for climate vulnerability, and applied that to assess the potential for distribution shifts, about 70 species had a high potential for shifts in distribution. That was a little bit surprising, but the South Atlantic is in many ways a transitional ecosystem. It's transitional between the more tropical ecosystems to the south and the more temperate boreal ecosystems to the north. So we get a lot of species that can kind of move into the system and potentially move out of the system. But overall, about 70% of the species had a high potential for shifts in distribution. And those are shown here in the orange and in the red. And if you look across these species and try to draw out some common characteristics, they tend to be larval dispersal. So the vast majority, if not all of these species in this orange box have pelagic larvae, a fairly long, several week long pelagic larval stage duration, and they can get distributed over large distances. A number of species also have really high mobility as adults. So a number of the shark species come out as very high potential for distribution schist, mostly because of their high mobility during the adult stage, not so much their reproductive system. And then a number of the pelagic species which seem to have general habitat requirements also have a high potential to shift their distribution. If we just look at the reef fishes, the highest potential for distribution schists, I'll just pull out the reef fish species in this orange box here, were species like black sea bass, and we have seen some indications that black sea bass is shifting or perhaps expanding its distribution to the north and maybe to deeper water. Other species like gray snapper and red snapper tend to be more at the southern end of the distribution in the South Atlantic, so we might expect them to shift north as conditions warm. And then some of the species that have more moderate potential for distribution shifts, red grouper, yellowtail snapper, snowy grouper, gag. And then those with the lowest potential tended to be really southern species like Nassau grouper and Goliath, which probably would not do well further north, or would have other factors that would limit their distribution further north, as well as some of the deep water species like Warsaw that seem to have fairly specific deep water habitat requirements. But overall, about 70% we would expect some potential for a shift in distribution. So we did take a second approach. This is a secondary to the vulnerability calculation, which is actually based on information. It's based on output from climate models. It's based on a synthesis of the literature. But we just asked the panel, what species, based on your experience, you think will be positively affected, negatively affected, or you just can't really tell for sure. And what this really pointed out is that, there's likely to be winners and losers under future climate. So we have a number of species here that people thought may be positively impacted. Here's some of the snapper grouper species here: gray snapper, vermilion, red snapper, mutton. They tend to be some of those rapidly growing, maybe a little shorter lived. Nobody thought that groupers or deep water groupers would be positively impacted, for example. And so this might shift fishing opportunities. It's not that, everything in the South Atlantic is going to move north. We might have species that move into the region or otherwise increase in the region. And that may create some new fishing opportunities for species that haven't historically been a big part of the commercial or recreational fisheries in the South Atlantic. So the key takeaways from the CBA, this was our first iteration of this. The intent is to repeat this into the future and improve on it. But the suggestion is that many of the species in the South Atlantic are likely to experience change in either their abundance, productivity, or their geographic distribution going into the future. Particularly oceanic conditions, things like sea surface temperature, ocean acidification, and the intrinsic population growth rate of the species, as well as its exploitation status. Those tend to be the main drivers of climate vulnerability. Of the reef fishes, groupers, particularly deep water groupers, had some of the higher vulnerabilities among the reef fish complex. And this was due to a combination of factors, I think. Their life history, they tend to be longer lived, slower growing. Several of them are in an overfish status. And because they are offshore and right there at the shelf slope break, they have pretty broad exposure to changes in oceanographic conditions throughout their life history. Most of the species have a high potential for changes in distribution, mostly due to the prevalence of broadcast spawning and in some cases the high mobility of the adults. And we may see some increases of species in our region, particularly those that have rapid population growth rates or an intrinsic ability to replenish themselves, or species that where the South Atlantic is really kind of at the northern limit of their geographic range. So we may see some species that moving into the region as well. And we've seen some indications of that, particularly some recruitment of species that spawn on the West Florida shelf, making it around the tip of Florida and settling in the South Atlantic region. So CVAs are one tool to conduct a broad assessment of a suite of species. They're not definitive by any means, but they do give us a way to look at the ecosystem as a whole, look at all of the species simultaneously, try to gauge which species may be vulnerable and which ones, as a result, we need to direct more attention to, and which maybe we don't need to focus on so much. But they're not definitive. So I wanted to just give a couple of case studies briefly. This is work that's ongoing with folks at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center and elsewhere that are more specific to snapper grouper, particularly these indications of recent recruitment declines, as well as some work that's really just beginning to start to look at these shifts in spatial distributions. And I don't want to imply that this is due to climate or due to climate change. We don't know that yet, but recruitment and spatial distributions are certainly impacted by conditions in the ocean, and those conditions are likely to be affected by changes in climate. So the recruitment declines, there's 2 points I want to make. We've seen a number of species that have shown declines in recruitment. And recruitment is basically the addition of young fish to the population. It's a measure of the reproduction of the population and the survival of those young fish to a size where they or enter the population. And these are estimates of recruitment. These come from our stock assessments for a whole suite of species. And there's 2 things to notice about this. One is that these recruitment declines, which are shown here in red, have occurred mostly for species that are winter spawners, winter early spring spawners. So gag grouper, porgy, black sea bass, snowy. We haven't really seen much in the way of recruitment declines for summer spawners, species like amberjack, great triggerfish. In some cases, like red snapper, it looks like there's been some increases in recruitment, though it's highly variable. And other species like vermilion, we really don't see any pattern at all. But this definitely seems to be a winter, early spring phenomena where we're seeing these recruitment declines. And there is some variability among species and when they occur, but they're all kind of occurring in the mid-2000s, around 2010, 2012, maybe 2015 in some cases. So this is a fairly recent thing over the last 10 or 15 years. And so we've been looking at what's going on in the ocean environment that might also be changing, and some of the things that I mentioned in the CVA that might be correlated or perhaps causing some of these declines in recruitment. And so one thing that has occurred is the Gulf Stream has been closer to shore since about the mid-2010s. You can see this is a indicator of the distance of the Gulf Stream from its mean distance from the coast. So it was in more of an offshore state through the early 2000s. And then since about 2012, 2015 or so, it's been much more in an onshore state, closer to shore. And that may have a variety of implications. We've also seen associated with that change in the position of the Gulf Stream, we've seen some increases in sea surface temperature as well. Those two things can actually affect upwelling. So upwelling is the transport of nutrients from deeper waters up onto the shelf and into the photic zone where there's light, and the combination of light and nutrients fuel plankton productivity, and that's what the offspring of the larvae of a lot of these species are dependent on during the first weeks and months of their life. So we've seen this combination of factors with increases in sea surface temperature, more onshore position of the Gulf Stream, and weaker upwelling that have occurred roughly over the last 10 to 15 years. And our hypothesis is that these changes in winter conditions are influencing the base of the food web. They're influencing the plankton and the surface waters that the larval life stages are dependent on, and that is a contributing factor to these declines in recruitment. There's a number of other hypotheses that we're looking at as well, but this is probably the leading one right now. So the second vignette or case study is related to geographic distributions. And so we know that climate projections suggest that there's going to be an expansion of the thermal range of several snapper grouper species in the next century. This is work that's just came out this year in a paper here, and what it's showing is the northern edge of that species range for six species currently in the black here, and then under different climate protection scenarios. So a couple of things to notice is one, the more extreme changes in climate, which are shown in red here, we expect higher temperatures and more northern shifts in the geographic distribution of these species. 38 degrees is roughly around Delaware Bay or so. And then with more moderate climate projections, we expect correspondingly, smaller shifts in distribution. There's also species differences. And these species differences are generally driven by what we know about these species' tolerances to temperature. So some species may shift quite a bit, like red porgy in this example, and some species may be less so, like greater amberjack. One thing to point out is this is a projection over about 100-year time frame, and it's based strictly on temperature. So what it's really telling us is that thermal habitat may be less of a barrier to geographic distribution shifts, but other conditions may still limit distribution. So for snapper grouper, hard bottom habitat is one thing that's a pretty strong requirement for these species. There's also been some studies that instead of looking ahead have looked back. And those have not suggested widespread shifts yet in the South Atlantic over like the last 10 to 30 years. So there's a disconnect between what's happened in the recent past in terms of species distribution, which haven't shown a whole lot of shifts, at least from most of the data that we have available, and what's projected to happen in the future. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in this, we do have a distribution mapping analysis portal called DisMap that you can go to at this link. And this is a tool that's easy to use. It's an online portal, and you can basically, similar to the vulnerability tool, you can put in your species, put in your region, and you can get information on how that species distribution has changed over time. We currently have just some of our coastal trawl surveys in the region in that portal, but we're planning to add some of the trap video surveys that are more targeted for the reef. Other places for information, I would encourage you to look is the South Atlantic Ecosystem Status Report, which also came out a couple of years ago, and it addresses some of these climate effects, but also a much broader array of components of the ecosystem, ranging from habitat to lower and upper trophic levels to the condition of the fisheries, as well as some of the demographic and other social changes in the system. Just to summarize, South Atlantic is rapidly developing. Fisheries, there's expanding fisheries and increasing tourism and recreation-based economy. There's indications that we're starting to see changes in ocean conditions, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. A lot of uncertainty about how those are going to affect reef fish and other fisheries going forward. But the CVA is one tool and other similar tools like the Ecosystem Status Report that can help us in providing context for how the system's changing, identify some of the risks that may be on the horizon, also develop hypotheses and more directed research to try to get at the details of how those changes are going to affect fisheries in our region. So I'd encourage you to get involved where possible. I think this venue is a good way to link some of the science with the stakeholders. There's a number of other opportunities through the Citizen Science Program of the Council, the Stock Assessment Council processes that lead to management decisions. Fishery performance reports are kind of an on-the-water synthesis of conditions in particular fisheries. And there's also a number of sort of topical participatory workshops that bring together scientists and stakeholders to try to better understand particular issues in the system. So I'd encourage you to participate in those where possible. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for showing up on a Easter Monday, and a number of people contributed to this listed here, and I would be glad to take any questions, or feel free to contact me if you have any feedback. But thank you.
Awesome, Kevin, thank you so much. That was a really great presentation, and I appreciate how much ground you were able to cover. I know that climate vulnerability is obviously a very complex topic, but I think you did a really phenomenal job of breaking that down. First question I see here is sort of going back to the idea of, climate vulnerability affects species indirectly through different ecosystem factors, thinking of prey, thinking of habitat. Is that something that is able to be currently modeled for each species, or is that sort of a emerging approach that's still being figured out, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. Generally, the CVA is based on things that are easily observable. So there are other processes, I think you mentioned a couple of them: food web dynamics, prey availability, distribution, those sorts of things that provide the mechanistic link between what's going on in the environment and the dynamics of these species. We do have some species distribution models, and I would encourage you to look at this Cow et al. Paper, and I would be glad to send that link. It's a multi-species model of distributions for 21 species in the South Atlantic. We're currently incorporating some of those environmental factors in that to see if we can use it to project changes in distribution. There also are a number of ecosystem models. There's a food web model, it's called EcoPath, EcoSim, that incorporates a bunch of species, but also a lot of the lower trophic levels, the prey species, and the environmental drivers. And it tries to get more at some of those mechanistic links that you're talking about. So it's a approach. It's a different approach than here. It's a complementary approach in a lot of ways. There's a trade-off though between things like mechanistic realism, how realistic is the model, and then the uncertainty in the model or the data you have to parameterize the model. So I think you need a combination of tools to try to get at these questions. But yeah, there is a growing number of ecosystem models for the region. One's being housed by FWC and Laura Gentry, and it's been presented to the South Atlantic SSC on a number of occasions, and I would be glad to put people in touch with those who are developing those models.
Absolutely, thank you. I was had a question following up on, you mentioned the fishery performance reports. Are you able to preview a little bit how those are constructed and if it's possible for our fishermen and attendants to, look into contributing as well? Because I know one thing that we hear pretty frequently when we do outreach is just a matter of species sort of expanding the range, being seen and caught in areas that are new and unexpected. So just curious if that's something they can contribute to science.
Yeah, I think so. So the fishery performance reports are relatively new. I know of them and have looked at some of them. I'm not intimately familiar with them. I think the council representative could certainly help with that. But the intent of those is that they complement the stock assessments. And so the stock assessments are a synthesis of all of the data on a particular species into a modeling framework that is used to, as I said before, try to estimate the abundance, the fishing mortality, and get quantitative information on sustainable harvest levels. So the fishery performance reports are designed to complement that because they're providing complementary and slightly different information. They're based on kind of local ecological knowledge, people's experience in the system, what they're observing on the water. And sometimes it's hard to get that information into a quantitative framework and a stock assessment. So I think they occur in parallel and they move through the SSC and the council management process, and they provide sort of complementary information. I can certainly put you in touch with one of the council staff who could tell you more of the details and how you could contribute to those efforts.
That's a great cue, because I'm actually going to pass over to Christina Curtis, who's a council member who can speak on the fishery plans a little bit more.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Curtis. I'm the fishery social scientist. I'm South Atlantic Council staff. And I thought, Kevin did a great job of sort of illustrating how once those fishery performance reports are prepared, they are used throughout the science and management process. So thank you for that, Kevin. I just wanted to add, particularly for any fishermen that are online, those fishery performance reports are put together by our advisory panels. Advisory panels consist of commercial for hire, recreational fishermen, dealers, restaurant owners who are all, involved and have a stake in the fisheries that the council manages. And they complete these fisheries performance reports during the meetings, and then council staff summarize them and then provide them to council members, scientists, so they can work their way through the process. If you are interested in being a member of an advisory panel, the council is actually soliciting applications for new advisory panels right now, and I can toss that link in the chat if anyone is interested.
Awesome, thank you, Christina. I think we have time for just one last question here, and it's going to be a very hard question to answer in 1 minute, but it sort of gets at the nature of management and how can natural resource managers remain adaptable. Obviously, species distributions and ecologies are changing in real time, as is our ability to also detect and understand them. So is there frameworks in place to remain adaptable as these conditions tend to change rapidly?
Yeah, that's a good question. My perspective is that we are expanding the types of information and the suite of tools that are going into inform fishery management decisions. And the fishery performance reports are one avenue, stock assessments are another avenue, CVAs are another avenue, ecosystem status reports are another avenue. So there is an increasing array of information sources. And these things are, they do enter in the management process in different ways. Some of them come in on the front end. So a lot of our stock assessments, we have an ecosystem consideration section where there's a working group that sort of assesses aspects of the ecosystem that are relevant to that species. There is, in some cases, efforts to include environmental factors in the stock assessment, but these other sorts of information sources do make the through the council process and can actually influence decision making on the back end without being formally incorporated into a stock assessment. So I think it's tough. It's a big ocean. It's hard to monitor. It's difficult to monitor in real time. Resources are always limited. But I'm encouraged that there's an increasing array of both sources of information and inclusion of various perspectives, from scientific perspectives to, as Christina was mentioning, the APs, which are populated by stakeholders and so forth. So I think that's a good approach, but to remaining adaptable and being flexible and addressing some of these management issues that are certainly going to be on the horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great response. And if there's further questions in that regard, again, you're more than welcome to email me or the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and we can kind of connect you to more resources in that regard. But we are at time, so I do want to be respectful of everyone's evening. So thank you all again for attending. Next week, we're going to be hosting the third and final Sea Grant Reef Fish webinar, and that's going to be covering movement and connectivity, specifically of greater amberjack. So same time, same day of the week next week, and look forward to seeing you guys there. Thank you.